Thank you, Rajabrakar sir, for the kind words of introduction. So today we'll be discussing about interventional study designs, and the most of the discussion will be focused on randomized control trials.
Should I stop the poll, ma'am, sharing?
Yes, please stop sharing the poll. So my screen is visible, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So here is my research question. I want to see whether chocolate consumption improves the scholastic performance. I can design the study in multiple ways. Let me design a study, an observational study to answer this question. So what I'm planning to do is to compare the chocolate consumption in students who score more than 80% and less than 80% in class 12 board exams. I'm randomly selecting 1,000 students from 10 schools in my locality, and I'm interviewing them after their class 12 exam results are out. So I have a structured questionnaire. I'm capturing data on many things, and along with I'm capturing the data on chocolate consumption in the month prior to the board exams. And this is my conclusion. Those who scored more than 80% mark, they took an average of 8.4 servings of chocolate in the month preceding the exams, whereas those who scored less than 80% marks, the servings of chocolate was 5.4, and the p-value was more than p-value was 0.004. Now the question is, with this design, can I definitely tell that it is the chocolate consumption which increased the scholastic performance in the students? So let us see what are the problems in arriving such a conclusion. So I just picked up 1,000 students from 10 schools in my locality. So it is possible that I might have actually some unknown factors might have operated while selecting the students. And also it is possible that the way I selected students, some of them might have volunteered. So this might introduce a bias there. And it is possible that some outliers are responsible for this results. There might be students who have extremely good marks. There might be some students who are having extremely low marks. And if the proportion of such students are too high, probably the results are not going to be that reliable. Then again, I did an interview, so there might be recall bias. And again, I might have introduced some bias. I didn't really work that much to obtain the data from some students. Some students actually, I just thought, okay, let it go. This sort of issues can happen from me as an observer. Then I didn't take into account the quality of academic program in any of the schools. The socioeconomic backgrounds might be different. Some of the students, those who afford chocolates probably might be coming from better socioeconomic backgrounds, and probably there might be some private tuitions for them. Then the type of chocolate, of course, I didn't specify. And if we start thinking like this, I can actually find quite a lot of problems in the study design. Even if we could list all the confounders, still quite a lot of unknown confounders remain. With such a design, we can never tell that it is a chocolate consumption which is related to the scholastic performance. It is the other way around is also possible. Probably people who have good scholastic performance, scholastic aptitude, probably they might be liking chocolate more also. So it is extremely difficult to prove a cause and effect with this sort of observational studies in this scenario. Now, the answer to the actual way to find whether there is a relationship between chocolate and scholastic performance is to give chocolate to one group, not to give chocolate to other group, and finally see whether there is any difference. So here I am thinking of an experimental design. This time I just want to see whether a nutritional supplement is associated with improved performance or growth in animals. So my plan is simple. I go to a couple of nearby kennels and I select the intervention group. The criteria I use to select the intervention group is every dog in even numbered kennel will get this nutritional supplement, whereas those dogs which are in the odd numbered kennels will get the regular diet. Okay. Now at the end of say I give this for around a month, and at the end I am assessing, and this is how my intervention arm looks and this is how my control arm looks. And in this scenario, is there any point in doing the comparison? So obviously my controls and intervention arm looks totally different, which is actually going to bias my results. this sort of designs in which actually the operator has some freedom to choose the participants, to assign the participants to intervention and control arm is called a quasi-experimental design. So this is a worst case scenario. If I'm a little bit careful, I can avoid this sort of scenario. Say I can actually keep the inclusion criteria a little bit strict. I can pre-specify that the dogs which will be included into this particular experiment, they should have a certain height, the age should be so and so, the weight should be so and so. Maybe if I want to be very specific, I can specify the color of their coat. I can actually specify that they should have sloppy ears. And even if I put quite a lot of specifications in the inclusion and exclusion criteria, sometimes the scenario might be like this. The two animals look somewhat similar, but actually they belong to two different breeds. Then the big question comes whether the characteristics of the breed is associated with the growth. This is the problem with quasi-experimental studies. Even in spite of putting the best efforts, you might actually end up having non-equivalent controls. And there is a very high degree of selection bias in this scenario. To avoid this sort of selection bias, the only way is the investigator should not have a control over who gets the intervention and who gets the control arm. So this should be selected purely by chance, which is done by randomization. And when randomization is done, you're getting two groups who are comparable in every aspect. The non-confounders, the unknown confounders are taken care of, and the only expected difference is the variable or the intervention which you are going to study. Now, another question which would come up is why there should be a control population, and again, why we should give a placebo in the randomized control trials. So when we give another question which might come to the mind of a beginner is, why can't we select a group, follow up them for some time, then introduce the intervention and compare the effect during the no intervention period and the intervention period. So whenever we introduce a treatment, we will see an effect. But the entire effect we are seeing is not exactly because of the treatment. A part of the effect is contributed by the treatment. Then even when the intervention arm receives the active control, there are some other factors which might operate. The moment you are getting recruited into a trial, probably the physician is going to spend quite a lot of time with you. The patient's queries gets answered. Quite a lot of positive reinforcement happens from the physician side as well as the patient side, and this probably might lead to an exaggerated treatment effect. Then again, methodological biases will come, which I will be dealing subsequently. And sometimes the improvement might be because of the natural cause of the disease. The classic dictum is chronic kidney disease is a relentlessly progressive disease. But if we examine the literature, at least 15 to 20% of those with chronic kidney disease, especially in CKD stages 3 and 4, they might show spontaneous improvement also. So it is possible that some aberration in the natural history of the disease might be responsible for the improvement. And finally, there is a phenomenon called regression to the mean, which I will explain in the next slide. This all will be contributing. Suppose if we don't have a control arm, we are likely to attribute the entire treatment effect because of the drug, whereas only a part of the treatment effect is contributed by the drug. Now, when we have a control, most of these biases, problems arising from regression to the mean and natural cause is taken off. But if actually the controls are not blinded, then probably the positive reinforcement doesn't happen. The patient knows that he is not being offered the treatment, it's a placebo. Patient might be a little disappointed, but still probably the effect is likely to get exaggerated. If we give a placebo, what is happening is patient doesn't know which arm the patient is allocated. There is a fair chance that the patient might be in the intervention arm, and also there's an equal chance that the patient might be in the control arm also. So what we are going to get is, when there is a blinded control, what we are going to get is the pure therapy specific effect of the drug. Now coming to the regression to the mean, this occurs with almost all this occurs in almost all biological systems. I hope some of you can understand the player. This is Magic Johnson. He played more than 13 seasons, and this is his scores. So if you see, In 1983-84, he had actually a maximum score, and subsequently this is happening to his scores. So this is actually a graphical plot showing what was happening to his scores. And what we can see is his scores are keeping on fluctuating around a mean values. Sometimes it is high, sometimes it is low. Without anything, it picks up. Again, it goes to the other side, and this cycle keeps on repeating. So let us assume Magic Johnson enrolls himself to a physical fitness program at this time. So a program is claiming to improve his physical performance. Now, if we assess the result at the next year, what is it showing? It is showing that his performance has not improved and it has even declined. On the other hand, if he enrolls himself for a program at this point, the next year actually his scores is going up. We might end up thinking that it is the physical fitness program which actually has led to his improvement of his scores. But we know that he didn't enroll for such a program. So now we know that it is a natural way things actually turn around. So usually there will be a high and then it comes back to the mean. Sometimes it goes to the lower side and again this keeps on repeating. So such phenomena can happen in almost all biological systems, and probably the parameter which you are addressing also might be exhibiting such a phenomena. So when you have a control arm, you are assuring that if this phenomena happens, it happens to the same extent in the two arms. Now, RCT, if you see the evidence pyramid, RCTs are placed above observational studies. Now, that brings to another important question, whether RCTs can answer all questions. RCTs are the way to answer every question which comes in your clinical practice. So, the answer is definitely no. So, to conduct an RCT, there should be sufficient uncertainty about the intervention. This is otherwise called equipoise. You have a patient coming to you with a particular disease condition. You should not know, you don't know what exactly, if you give a particular intervention, you don't know whether it is going to benefit. You don't know whether it is not going to benefit. Such uncertainty is the actual situation where you should have a randomized control trial. And even if uncertainty is there, it should be absolutely safe for the participant. For example, if you want to see what happens, like we all know that parachute protects from falls while actually somebody is jumping from the sky. Now, if you want to demonstrate that actually parachutes do protect, is it feasible to have a randomized control trial with one arm having a tube and the other arm doesn't have? It's not safe. So such a scenario is not justified. So another situation is people with hyperkalemia, ESRD patients with hyperkalemia. We know that we need to dialyze these patients, otherwise they are going to die because of some arrhythmia. Now, if we want to prove that this is actually a practice guideline which has not come from any randomized control trial. Now, if we want to prove that by an RCT, we will be denying dialysis to a particular arm, which is not safe and which is unethical also. And again, another thing is, the outcome should occur over a reasonable time period. For example, if we are dealing with an outcome which is going to happen after say 10 or 15 years, then it is not feasible to run an RCT. We can have a cohort design, or we can even have a case control study if the outcome is going to be somewhat rare. And it is not suitable for studying rare diseases where the information will be obtained from a case control study. And you should never do an RCT for studying the natural history of the diseases or an etiology of an agent. You can have observational designs to answer these questions. Now, coming to how to design a randomized control trial. A randomized control trial needs quite meticulous planning. And the first and foremost thing in planning a randomized control trial is you have to identify your team and you should be ready with the research proposal. So this will be the scope of discussion. I will not be dealing much on funding and ethical consideration because this will be taken in another session. So once actually you have a research proposal ready, the second important step is you should present it before the ethical committee of your institution and you have to get it approved. So once the ethical committee approval is there, you have to apply for a trial registration. In India, Indian Council of Medical Research is maintaining a clinical trial registry, and you have to get your study registered in CTRI. The CTRI does not give any retrospective registration. The problem, if you don't register your trial, the problem is ultimately if there is any dispute occurring, then actually you are going to land in real trouble, because the law doesn't permit any trials to be undertaken in India without CTRI registration. So even if you safely complete your study, all the journals will ask for registration with any trial registries. This is to ensure that actually we are not deviating from the pre-specified plan, and you are not manipulating the data to give a favorable result for whatever intervention you are trying. Then after the trial registration, only after getting the trial registration, you have to start the trial, and you have to conduct the trial. Then you have to analyze the results and you have to report it. This reporting should be done as per the consort guidelines. Now, the most important aspect of an RCT is formulation of the research question. Madam Usha Datta had given a very beautiful talk on how to frame the research question. So I'm just recapitulating a few points only. It should be in the PICO format. So I have a hypothesis here that uric acid lowering is beneficial in preventing the progression of CKD. So how should my research question look like? So my P is population. This is CKD stage 3 and 4. I is the intervention, that is lowering uric acid to 6 milligram per kilogram, 6 milligram per deciliter with allopurinol. C is my control arm, that is a placebo. Outcome is retarding the progression of kidney disease, and time is over a period of 1 year. So another research question. My hypothesis is that rituximab is better than modified Pondicelli regimen in membranous nephropathy. My study population is nephrotic syndrome due to primary membranous nephropathy. Intervention is 2 doses of IV rituximab repeated 2 weeks apart. Control is modified Pondicelli regimen. Outcome is remission. It can be complete remission or partial remission. You can define if you wish. And the time period is 18 months. Now coming to the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So inclusion, by setting the inclusion criteria, you are identifying a population where the intervention is feasible. The results are, it's likely to produce results. And you should be careful that it should not be too lax. It should neither be too restrictive. For example, if we take the previous research question, suppose I am recruiting patients with CKD stage 3 and 4 without hypertension, without diabetes, without proteinuria, and without much severe acidosis, and I am able to prove that giving uric acid in this population prevents the progression of CKD. The question is, there are two problems which will arise. One is, my inclusion criteria is very strict. I want CKD 3 and 4 without hypertension, without proteinuria, without diabetes, without metabolic acidosis. The chances of finding such a population is going to be very low. In case, even if I find such a population and I successfully conduct the study, the problem is I might not be able to generalize it to the CKD population around me, because we know that diabetes is going to be the commonest cause for CKD. Quite a lot of people will become hypertensive by the time they reach CKD 3 and 4, and most of them might be having acidosis. So you will be unlikely to find a population outside the trial study, outside the trial scenario, to use this intervention which you found to be beneficial. And suppose if I keep it 2 lakhs, it is possible that, for example, if I actually start doing recruiting the patient from CKD stage 1 onwards, EGFR more than 90 with proteinuria, then it is very likely that I might not be able to show the effect in this particular population. Now the exclusion criteria, suppose if it's a placebo controlled study, the patient it should be acceptable to put the patient on placebo. For example, I want to study whether rituximab works in membranous nephropathy. Can I keep the control arm on a placebo? Unlikely, because actually it's not a good idea good idea not to treat an active nephrotic syndrome for a period of 6 months or 1 year. And again, if I, in the same membranous nephropathy example, if I include patients with very low GFR, say GFR less than 30 ml or so, it is possible that actually whatever I do, whether I give rituximab or whether I don't give rituximab, this group might progress and I might not be able to demonstrate the clinical effect. And the patient should not have any other conditions interfering with the treatment or measurements or outcome. Let us take the first example, uric acid in CKD progression. Now, if I am including patients with psoriasis, they are going to have very high uric acid levels. And probably this is actually going to interfere in the way I interpret the results. Patients having uncontrolled blood sugars, which can interfere with the creatinine measurement. So I might underestimate the GFR because the creatinine was furiously elevated because of the uncontrolled blood sugar status. Then if you feel that the patient population will not adhere to the treatment, the problem is if you end up recruiting such patients, you're going to lose them somewhere in the trial, and this is going to affect your trial outcome. Your trial outcome becomes less reliable with quite a lot of follow-up. Then there might be some other practical reasons. A patient might be willing to the study, the patient is promising that the patient will be adherent, but the patient stays say 500 kilometers away from your center. So there's no point in recruiting such a patient. Now, there is something called enriched enrollment design. So basically the idea when somebody designs an RCT is you want a successful trial. So enriched enrollment allows to increase the proportion of responders and decrease the number of withdrawals. So there are many ways by which actually enrichment can be done. So let us assume a scenario in which I want to do a trial in a non-ICU setting. My research question is whether early dialysis is associated with better outcome in acute kidney injury in the non-ICU setting. So my plan is I am planning to start dialysis the moment patient just passes to AKI2, that's in the early group, and in the late group I am going to wait around 12 hours after making the diagnosis of AKI stage 3. Now, in such a scenario, you know that especially in the non-ICU setting, some of those AKIs can be reversible. Even if it is in AKI stage 2, within 48 hours, it can reverse. So the most important question that would come is whether those patients in the AKI early initiation group, who have just passed on to the AKI stage 2, whether they were really having a non-reversible AKI, and if we had actually waited for some more time, either the AKI would have reversed or the renal failure would have improved spontaneously. So such a question is going to affect the validity of my study in a very negative way. So what I want to ensure is I am recruiting patients who are having non-progressive acute kidney injury. So in what way I can actually do that? As of now, the inclusion criteria, there is nothing like that. There is no inclusion criteria which would actually help you to identify these patients who will have a progressive acute kidney injury. So if we search the literature, there are some ways we can actually employ some of those in this trial. What we can do is we can actually check the levels of biomarkers, say the IGF binding protein 7 or TIM2, and we can recruit those patients who have an abnormal IGF binding protein 7 and TIM2 ratio. The other scenario is you can do a furosemide stress test and you can recruit patients who are actually non-oliguric, and you are actually cherry picking these patients from a larger population and you are randomizing them. So this is one way I have done: test all participants, then randomize the responders. Okay. Then sometimes even when we don't really have any literature on certain scenarios, we will be doing an RCT and we will be identifying that certain subgroups are responding well and certain subgroups are not responding well. So the best situation in those scenarios is to have a follow RCT with those who responded, or use the same criteria as the responders in the previous study. Then sometimes in chronic conditions, like for example, patients who are on pain medications and all, pain is so notorious for inter-individual variability. There are certain people who would respond to any medications, and there are certain people who won't respond to any other medications. So if we end up having all these patients together, it is possible that depending on the characteristics of the population enrolled, your study might be a negative study, or sometimes you might end up actually getting some false positives also. So in pain studies and all, what researchers do is they will withdraw all the pain medications for some time, and some patient nothing happens. The pain intensity doesn't increase even on the withdrawal. Such patients are dropped out, and those patients who complain of pain on withdrawal of the drug, they are actually randomized to the future trial, because these patients have a high chances of responding to newer medications. Now coming to the trial designs. This is the simplest design which we know and most common. You randomize your subjects. You no longer call people as patients. Once you enroll into a trial, they are called subjects. You randomize subjects into two arms. There's an intervention arm and there's a control arm. And control arm, sometimes you will give placebo, and there are various ways it can be done. Okay. For example, you want to compare two treatments. We know that membranous nephropathy, you can give Pondicelli regimen, you can give cyclosporin, and you can give rituximab. So cyclosporin is somewhat inferior as per the existing literature. Now we want to compare which one is better, whether rituximab is better or whether modified Pondicelli's regimen is better. Such scenarios where there are two established treatments, we can always compare them to find out which one is better, and also we can actually compare the safety profile also. So another scenario is you want to introduce a new treatment, but it is difficult to remove the existing treatment. The classic design, this was used in the LUNAR trial and the Explorer trial. Patients with lupus nephritis, they were getting mycophenolate, and the researchers wanted to add rituximab. So that time the data on rituximab in lupus was not that great. So it was difficult to get regulatory approvals, and it also sounded unethical to not to give mycophenolate to one arm. So what the study group did was they continued both groups on mycophenolate, added rituximab to one arm along with mycophenolate and placebo to the other arm. Then sometimes you can actually do dose escalation studies. Here all the three arms receive the intervention. It could be two arms or it could be more than three arms also. So you start off with the intervention in all the arms. Now in one arm you escalate to a higher degree, you escalate to a middle degree in the other arm, and in the last arm you continue with the baseline dose. This is to see which dose is going to be effective and to compare the safety and efficacy profiles of different drug dosing. And a pure placebo, experimental therapy versus a placebo, that is given only when there is no standard treatment existing. So tomorrow, let us say somebody is coming with a definitive treatment for oxalosis. We all know that whatever treatment for primary oxalosis is ineffective. So such situation, it might be justifiable to put the group on placebo. But if any treatment exists, it is not at all justified to stop the treatment, and you cannot start placebo in such trial designs. Now, there would be trial designs which involves an injection to two different type of drugs. Let us say one would be an injection, the other would be an oral. Or it could be an oral drug. One drug needs more frequent administration and the other drug needs less frequent administration. So here we do something called a double dummy design. For example, you want to compare mycophenolate and cyclophosphamide. So obviously blinding is not going to work because one is an injection and one is a drug. So what you do is you add an oral placebo to the cyclophosphamide arm and an injectable placebo to the mycophenolate arm. This is called a double dummy design. And then again, we use run-in periods in randomized controlled trials. Again, run-in period somehow ensures that people who are really willing, people who are likely really willing are recruited, and people who default are sorted out. So you can have a run-in period with a placebo for some time after selecting the patients, but before randomization, and people who successfully complete this run-in period will be randomized. Then there's another design, crossover design, where patients will be randomized. Like in this design, both arms receive both treatments. So only thing is the order in which they receive treatment is different. So the first group receives the first treatment in the first half. The other group receives other treatment or placebo, whatever it is. Now, after some time, you stop drugs in both groups, wait for a washout period. This washout period is decided by the pharmacodynamics of the drug. Generally, 4 to 5 half-life is sufficient. Suppose if it's a longer acting drug or a drug which is actually going to be lipid soluble with secondary release and all, we have to give slightly longer washout period. And after the washout, they reverse the treatment arms and you are going to assess the outcomes. And crossover designs are not suitable in every situations. So first, we are actually trying to find the efficiency of the drug. The drug treatment should not alter the disease. So chronic stable conditions, for example, somebody having asthma, somebody having chronic pain, and this drug should not have any prolonged effect, because suppose if we give a treatment A and the effect lasts for quite a long time, then we will not be able to assess the effect of treatment B. So some carryover effect of treatment A happens when we give the treatment B. Then another problem is sometimes actually the intervention changes the disease course in an irreversible way. For example, you are comparing infertility treatment to infertility treatment, and let us say a few patients in the treatment A became pregnant. Then obviously they cannot, the pregnancy is not a scenario in which you should use a carryover design. But suppose you end up using a carryover design in such a scenario, the patient becomes pregnant at the end of the treatment A. Now actually we will not be able to assess the effect of treatment B. The importance of this crossover designs is here every patient acts as his or her own control, and because of this crossing over we need much lesser sample size. Of course, the analysis plan is not going to be straightforward, and another problem with this crossover designs is here we are actually subjecting patients to 2 treatments. So the chances of finding dropouts are going to be very high. So if we end up having a carryover effect or a period effect or large dropout, then these are things which are going to affect the integrity of your trial. Now there is yet another design called factorial design. Here, factorial design, you first randomize the participant to an intervention. So let us say we are comparing drug A and placebo. And again, this group is again further randomized to receive another drug, drug B and placebo B. This is a simple factorial design which is called a 2 by 2 factorial design. There could be more factors. For example, here if 3 groups were there, it becomes a 3 by 2 factorial design. So why should we go for factorial designs? See, basically these are 2 studies which are condensed into a single trial. So we will have people who are exposed to drug A and we will have people who are exposed to drug B, and we will be able to see whether there is any interaction between these drugs. Drug A, whether it is actually acting synergistically with drug B. The problem with this factorial design is there should not be an obvious interaction between treatment. So there should not be a pharmacologic interaction. And sometimes we do the factorial design just to study the interaction, but that's a totally different scenario. And again, if you see, there is a group who does not receive any drug. There is a group which receives both placebo A and B, and it must be acceptable not to administer the individual treatment in this group. And preferably, it is always better to use treatments that use totally different mechanisms of action. So if you see, the design is a little complex, the analysis also is going to be a little complex compared to parallel arm trials. Now, we move on to the phases of the trial. This is from a regulatory standpoint. When somebody wants to market a new drug, this is the way it should pass through. First, there will be preclinical studies. A lot of animal testing and all happens in this stage, and probably this runs into years. And then we go into the phase 1 trial. Here, there won't be any controls and minimum number of participants are selected. Most of the time, it would be somewhere around 20 to 50. And here, the only aspect tested are whether the drug is safe. Does it produce any intolerable adverse effect, any life-threatening drug effects? And what dose we can give. And in the phase 2 trial, what we are doing is whether this is going to be efficient. For example, you are developing a drug against IgA nephropathy. This is the time when you are going to administer the drug in IgA nephropathy patients. Here, what we want to study is the efficacy of the drug. And now, if it passes this phase 2, we'll move on to the phase 3. Phase 2 also involves lesser number of patients, maybe around 100 to 200, not more than that. And phase 3 is the scenario where we go for a proper randomized controlled trial. Here, we are going to test the safety and efficacy of the drug, and we are going to compare it with an existing treatment. And this, if this phase is successfully done, this leads to the licensing of the drug. And phase 4 is the post-marketing studies, which involves maybe many thousands of patients. Now, another name which often comes in the context of randomized controlled trial is a pragmatic versus explanatory trials. So pragmatic trial is basically something which is practical, what we do in our usual care setting. Whereas an explanatory trial, probably this is more towards a research setting. So sometimes it is not possible to divide trials into a completely pragmatic trial and explanatory trial. Some pragmatic trials will have some explanatory component and vice versa. Some explanatory trials will have a component of pragmatism. Now we move on to the trial designs, superiority, equivalence, and non-inferiority designs. So this is taken from a blog where somebody was trying to address the problem of trainee shortage in nephrology. So this is not somebody boasting that actually nephrologists are the smartest physician, but if we just take out this sentence, if somebody from non-nephrology specialty reads this sentence, probably they might think that the nephrologists are boasting and they might want the nephrologist to prove it. So now that brings to a question, are nephrologists smarter? Suppose if we want to prove that nephrologists are smarter. So you all might have experienced in your school days, there would be tough competition between, most of you would have been school toppers, and there would be, you always had a person with whom you are always fighting for the first slot. And there's only one way to prove that you are the best, that is by scoring at least a mark above compared to your nearest contender. So don't think how you would randomize nephrologists and other physicians. I'm just trying to elicit this concept only. Let us say if we want to prove that nephrologists are smarter, and let us say there is a specialty non-specific smartness index. It doesn't relate to nephrology question, it actually relates to your mental abilities. Let us assume that if there is a study, if there is such an exam with a mark of 1 to 100 marks, and you have some previous observational data about the performance of nephrologists as well as the other physicians. Now, in such a study, you can have two types of endpoints. It could be a continuous variable like the mark obtained by nephrologist and other physician. Or suppose if the study is actually like a difficult to pass study, you don't really get 10% marks. In such scenarios, you can put it as a categorical variable, the proportion who passes the test. Sorry. Yeah. Now, let us say there is some historical data to prove that other physicians' maximum score is somewhere around, say, 75 marks. Now, if you want to prove this, the nephrologist has to get a mark above 75. Here, the 0 doesn't mean 0 mark. This means that there is no difference. I'm trying to explain the concept with the mean values as well as the confidence intervals. So, this 0 means that there is no difference between the performance of other physicians and nephrologists. Now, if you are getting a value above this, let us say other physicians score 70. In order to prove that the nephrologists are superior, the nephrologist has to score a value above 70 and the lowest confidence interval should not go below 70. So suppose if a nephrologist goes, say, a value like 90, 80 is the confidence interval here and 90 is the confidence interval here, fine. You're proving that nephrologists are superior. So sometimes you might end up scoring, say, 72 or 73. Again, no issues as long as the confidence interval is above the mark scored by other physicians. But suppose the nephrologist scores 71, other physicians score 70, and the confidence interval of nephrologist is 69, drops to 69, then nephrologists are not going to be considered as superior to other physicians. Here, the null hypothesis is there is no difference in the smartness index of the nephrologist and non-nephrologist. Now, I am replacing this with the actual scenario which we are going to come across. You have a new drug. You want to see whether the new drug performs better than a placebo. You are dealing with a situation in which there is no specific treatment. So the effectiveness of the new drug, let it be the proportion of the patients who get a cure, or the absolute value of a particular parameter you are getting it. So it should be above the score scored by the placebo, and the confidence interval of your whatever proportion or your continuous variable, it should actually not cross the upper confidence interval of the placebo drug. Now, superiority designs are designed to prove that the new treatment is better than the old treatment. And most of the superiority designs happen when there is no standard therapy available. And in a regulatory setting, it is quite uncommon to find a superiority design, but whereas quite a lot of pragmatic trials employ this design to show that the new treatment, like both might be licensed, and the new treatment might be better than the superior treatment. Now that brings to another important question, statistical superiority versus clinical superiority. Sometimes you might test a drug and you find that you are testing a drug to retard the progression of the chronic kidney disease. And now you are finding that there is only a 1 ml difference between the drug versus the control. And now the question is whether this 1 ml difference is significant or not. Such scenarios won't happen if you put some mind in at the time of calculating your sample sizes. Now, coming to the equivalence design. Equivalence design, you are trying to prove that the drug A and drug B are equal, but it is very difficult to show that they are equal. So what we do is we define a margin, and this margin here, what I have defined is there is a drug, there is a new drug and there is an old drug. So what I am trying to prove is the new drug is equal to the old drug. So not equivalent to the old drug, not equal. So I define a margin of equivalence. Here actually what I have defined is the new drug, the difference should be around 10%. So 10%, this is actually divided equally around the zone of difference. 0 means that there is no difference. 5 means that if it goes this way, this means that the old drug is better. If it goes this way, it means that the new drug is better. So what I want to prove is, I want to get an effect somewhere in this with the confidence intervals here. Suppose if I get the effect size here at the end of the trial and the confidence interval here, it means that the new drug is not equivalent. In fact, my old drug is better. Okay. So here there is a reversal in the hypothesis. In superiority designs, the null hypothesis is there is no difference between the old drug and the new drug. But in equivalence designs, there is a reversal of hypothesis. The null hypothesis is the new drug and old drug are different or not equivalent. Now we reject the null hypothesis. We are proving that they are equal. So this sort of designs usually happen when you compare a generic drug with an existing one. So it is again hard to find equivalence designs in new drug testing. Now coming to the non-inferiority design. So non-inferiority design, you are always comparing a new drug with an existing treatment. So here the null hypothesis is the new drug is inferior compared to the old drug. You want to prove that the new drug is non-inferior to the old drug by rejecting the null hypothesis. Here, if you remember in this equivalent studies, the margin is distributed equally in between the effect sizes. Whereas in non-inferiority design, you are choosing a margin which is actually somewhat acceptable. Now, how we will choose the margin? We have to use your clinical judgment as well as some statistics. So, for example, you want to check whether a new drug which is marketed, which is about to get marketed, is okay, is comparable, is non-inferior to an old drug. So, first what you need to do is you have to find out data about the efficacy of this old drug compared to placebo. Let us say the old drug, I am actually digging out the data and I am finding that the previous reported efficacy, the ability of this old drug to induce a remission in any given situation varied from say 40% to 60%. So I just got around 10 or 15 studies. There is no meta-analysis. So I'm trying to pool the effect from all the studies, and the lowest is 40 and the other highest is 60. Now what I have to see is, I have to see how much is the mean effect of the old drug. Let us say it comes as 50%, and I have to see how much is the confidence interval. And let us see the lowest confidence interval comes as 40. So now what I need to do is I have to select an inferiority margin. I expect the new drug to be minimum, to be somewhat effective, but it's slightly inferior, but the inferiority margin is in an acceptable range. Let us say the old drug 40% is the lowest confidence interval. Now I have to choose a margin which is acceptable. It should not be, I cannot actually tell that the new drug, the efficacy should be 20% compared to the old drug. It needs to be slightly higher depending on the scenario. So now here I am choosing a margin which is actually 10% compared to the efficacy of the old drug. Now here what I am interested is only in this margin. Now at the end of the study, if I am getting an efficacy of the new drug in this location, that is beyond the margin, then that means that my new drug is non-inferior and there is no point in further trying to market it. So I'm not really bothered about here. Sometimes I'll get the effect here and all the confidence intervals goes here. Then that means that the new drug is, sorry, this is the old drug, and what we are actually really, I think actually some mix-up happened. Okay. So this should have been otherwise, okay? So what, let us say, I'm selecting this non-inferiority margin, and this is actually means that this 0 means that there is no difference between the new drug and the old drug. So if I select the new non-inferiority margin as 10%, that means that the efficacy of the new drug should not be less than 10%. For example, the old drug, the efficacy in the test, it gives 50%. I am selecting the non-inferiority margin as 10%. It means that the lowest confidence interval of the new drug should not be less than 40. For example, I got like this. The old drug, the success rate is a 50% with a confidence interval of 55 and 45. And new drug, I am getting the efficacy rate is 45 with a lower confidence interval of 41 and upper confidence interval of 49. It is well below the 10% margin, and now I conclude that the new drug is non-inferior. So why do we need non-inferiority designs? So we need to compare a new treatment with the existing one, because the new treatment might be, all treatment might be efficacious, but the new drug which we are coming up with might be having a better toxicity profile. It might be easy to administer the drug, and it might be less invasive. For example, the old drug might require frequent infusions. And if you are actually testing a new drug, which is actually say 5% or 10% less efficacious when compared to the all drug, still it is okay to proceed with it. And again, this is what I told, how much would be the non-inferiority margin. It should not be really left to your judgment, because if it is just left to your judgment alone, you might end up actually making some major errors. So you should actually see some available literature to decide how much should be the minimum acceptable efficacy of the drug. Now, there are potential issues with the non-inferiority design. So both drugs are equivalent doesn't really mean both drugs are safe. It is possible that both drugs are equivalent, both drugs could be unsafe as well. Then sometimes the phenomenon called biocreep sets in. So what is happening is, let us say you have a drug A, you test a new drug B, you keep the non-inferiority margin as say 20% lower compared to the actual efficacy of the drug A. Now after some time, drug B becomes the standard of care. Now, after some time, again, if you come up with a drug C, you're going to compare with this drug B. So if this happens for a couple of cycles, ultimately we might end up with a new drug, which is actually much lower efficacious when compared to the original drug. So the other two questions are whether actually data from a failed superiority trial can be used to demonstrate non-inferiority. That is actually a difficult situation. So we will come to that towards the end of the study. Whether actually can you switch on between you started design, whether you can switch on between the design. Now let us come to another research question. Can doctors be replaced with nurse practitioners in the COVID triage area? The country is actually going through a COVID crisis, and we are having quite a lot of shortage of staff everywhere. So what would be the best trial design for this? Now, will you go for a superiority design? If you see doctors have better training in triage, their skills might be different. So it might be unfair to go with a superiority design. Second is, can we actually go for an equivalence design? Again, actually that's difficult because they are having a totally different skill sets. Now, what actually you can do in such a scenario is you can go for a non-inferiority design. Now coming to the endpoints of the trial. The endpoint measures the main clinical effect of the trial. It should be something which is clinically meaningful, how the patient feels, functions, or survives. And it could be objective like a death, or an event like a disease remission or flare-up. It could be subjective like improvement in pain, frequency of headaches, like that. And the primary endpoint, it is better if you could actually stick on to one endpoint, but some scenarios you have to select between, you have to have more than one endpoints. And it should be decided prior to the study. You cannot keep on changing the endpoint in between. Ideally, it should be a clinical endpoint, but sometimes you use some surrogate marker also, and your sample size calculations are based on this primary endpoints. Let us see the first research question which we dealt, whether uric acid lowering retards the CKD progression. What would be your endpoint? So I'm just actually listing out 5 different endpoints. So let us actually take one by one. So can we keep risk of progression to ESRD at 1 year at the endpoint? See, we are actually taking patients with GFR 59 ml to 16 ml. Now, in 1 year, what proportion of them would actually progress to ESRD? If it was a longer trial, probably there was no problem in taking the risk of progression to ESRD at 1 year. So this might not be the best primary endpoint. Now, risk of death. Yeah, deaths might happen, but again, we are going to follow up these patients only for a period of 1 year. Difference in uric acid levels. Obviously, this doesn't really make any sense, because what you want to see is whether uric acid lowering is going to prevent the progression in CKD. Now, risk of moving one stage down. Again, that is difficult because sometimes CKD 3 patients remain stable for quite a longer period of time. So what would be the most reasonable primary endpoint? The difference in the estimated eGFR at the end of 1 year. The primary endpoints can be different types. It could be a continuous measurements like a blood pressure or glomerular filtration rate. It should be a binary endpoint like death, remission status, or it could be time to event like graft survival. Sometimes it could be ordinal, like you have a grading for pain, frailty. Sometimes it would be counts like episodes of hypertension following renal replacement therapy. Then sometimes it could be unordered categories also. So coming to the surrogate endpoint, ideally it is always better to put a clinical endpoint. For example, a clinical endpoint like death, there won't be any controversies. A clinical endpoint like remission, again, there won't be any controversies. But sometimes, like in the study design which we saw, we cannot actually put a very hard endpoint like death or dialysis. So in that scenario, we go for a surrogate endpoint, which is actually a laboratory marker. In the previous example, we have taken estimated GFR as the surrogate endpoint. It could be some other physical sign also, and it should exist in the therapeutic pathway between the drug and the effect. The commonly used surrogate endpoints include HbA1c, eGFR, blood pressure, etc. Now, let us say I have put two questions. What will you choose, whether it's a surrogate endpoint or a clinical endpoint? Now, we want to study the effect of a new lipid lowering agent in the general population. It is okay to take a surrogate endpoint like the LDL cholesterol levels because you want to market a drug. Now, if you want to market the same drug by proving its efficacy in the ESRD population, what will you choose, whether it's LDL cholesterol or something else? From the existing data, we know that actually LDL cholesterol doesn't really translate into cardiovascular risk reduction in end-stage renal disease. So if you put the same agent in an end-stage renal disease population, the important, like it might not be okay to put a surrogate endpoint. It might be okay to put a clinical endpoint like the number of deaths or so. Then let us come to another situation like depression. Depression doesn't have a definitive diagnostic criteria. Similarly, remission of depression also doesn't have any definitive criteria. So you use multiple tools. So you use clinical assessment and various depression scales. Now you might come across a situation in which both are okay, like both are telling that depression is improving, then fine, you can actually proceed. But suppose your clinical assessment is negative and your depression scale shows improvement, you cannot definitely tell that this is going to improve. So there might be scenarios in which actually you don't have a single endpoint to end the trial. So now if we start a trial in depression, you will have to, the endpoint should be the clinical assessment as well as improvement in any of the depression scales. Such endpoints are called co-primary endpoints. They are actually related and all endpoints needs to be met to tell that the trial is a success. So it is sometimes co-primary endpoints are used when your disease have multiple aspects. There are multiple ways to assess the impact and there is no gold standard exists and there is no consensus on which is going to be the best. When you select co-primary endpoints, you have to meet both the co-primary endpoints to tell that the trial is a success. Now, this is another scenario. I am actually using a medication on burn. So the effect size, it could be wound healing and which happens at some time, and it would be scarring which happens at a later date. Okay. In these scenarios, achieving any one of these objectives would be okay. Okay, if it heals the wound better. Okay, if the wound healing is somewhat similar compared to the existing treatment, but it results in delayed scarring, then again it is going to be okay. So here there are other scenarios as well. These are two events which happen in different points of time. Again, in the uric acid example, suppose I want to assess whether lowering of uric acid reduces the CKD progression, and I have some other objective in mind. There is some data to tell that uric acid lowering leads to regression of the left ventricular hypertrophy. So in the same study, at the same time, I can actually study this too. In such cases, we call it as multiple primary endpoint. And we can actually call the trial a success if any one of these are met. Both need not be met. But the problem with multiple primary endpoints are you have to, the sample size will be increasing and the alpha error keeps on exaggerating when you have more than one primary endpoint. Now, if you set the alpha error at 0.05 and if you are trying to study two separate primary endpoints, then probably you are exaggerating the alpha error and you will have to make appropriate adjustment during the sample size calculations. Now there is yet another endpoint which is actually called a composite endpoint. Let us say we have a drug which actually works in patients with CKD3, and the endpoint I am keeping is end-stage renal disease. But we know that, and I have a sufficiently long follow-up to reach this endpoints. But we know that all patients with CKD3, they do not really go into end-stage renal disease. Some of them will get transplanted and some of them will die. So if I keep death ESRD as the endpoint, I am likely to miss these patients who actually had other endpoints. So do you think that death is somewhat different from ESRD? In fact, it is actually having a much more weightage when compared to the end-stage renal disease. So this is something, this is called competing risk. So when the disease course is punctuated by multiple competing risks, if you select one particular endpoint, you might miss major events which happens before reaching that endpoint. And again, it will not actually give you a clear idea of how the disease progresses or how the disease responds to intervention. The most important composite endpoints, like if you see, a lot of literature is there from cardiovascular studies, major adverse cardiovascular outcomes. And again, actually this might vary. Some studies include unstable angina and other things. Like that, we have major adverse kidney endpoints as well. So whatever endpoints we are putting together, they should be clinically meaningful and of somewhat similar importance. And in some scenarios, the individual endpoint, the number of patients reaching the individual endpoint might be small. And again, if we actually keep that particular endpoint, you have to end up having a big sample size to meet all these endpoints. So this individual effect sizes should be small, but when they add up, they should be significant. And it should be plausible by the disease biology. It should be related to the natural history of the disease. But there are, of course, certain problems when we, there are advantages as well as problems. So advantages, the competing risks are going to be avoided and we get more information on the disease course. And of course, so for example, your endpoint occurs with a frequency of say 3%. To study that, you have to have a huge sample size. So when you actually combine multiple endpoints which occur in a frequency of say 3 to 5%, the overall frequency of the endpoint becomes 15% or 20%. Now that will lead to reduced sample sizes as well as follow-up time, and it is going to reduce the expense of the trial as well. And again, when we combine everything, the power of the study increases, but again, what you need to keep in mind is the study might not be sufficiently powered to assess individual endpoint. It might be sufficiently powered to assess the composite endpoint. And again, you need not actually worry about the multiplicity adjustments and other things. The problem, but there are problems with the composite endpoints. See, this is actually data from the irbesartan diabetic nephropathy trial. Inclusion criteria was patients with diabetes, hypertension, kidney disease, and proteinuria. So there were 3 arms, and there was a composite endpoint which comprised of doubling of creatinine, onset of ESRD, and death. And this is how the data shows. Now, actually, if you see the graph, irbesartan actually reduces the composite endpoint. Now, if we dwell deeper into the data, a good majority of the patients attained the outcome of doubling of serum creatinine compared to those with ESRD or transplant or death. So, doubling of creatinine definitely is much more of a lesser significance compared to passing on to ESRD or death. So, probably because we have actually combined a less relevant endpoint, we are unable to tell whether irbesartan is going to prevent the chances of progressing to end-stage renal disease, whether irbesartan is preventing the chances of death in patients receiving the intervention. Now, this is another scenario which might face. We have a composite endpoint of MI and death. Now, if we see this graph, we are actually almost sure that the intervention actually works. There is a huge difference between the control and the intervention. Now, when we split the graph based on MI and death, you see the intervention reduces the MI, but the prevalence of death is going to be somewhat similar. Now the question is, can we call the intervention effective at this time? The other scenario, now actually there is no difference between the intervention and the control. Now, when we again actually put a stratified diagram, see what we are seeing is intervention arm is associated with more death, less death, but more MIs. Whereas the control is having more deaths and less amount of MI. Now, whether this is going to be effective or not, the intervention arm definitely reduces the death, but since we defined as a composite endpoint, there is not much of a difference also. These are the problems which happens with composite endpoints. The first three we have discussed, and sometimes it is possible that we have put say 5 components in the composite endpoint and only 3 events happened. In such cases, the power, the statistical power of the study comes down. And again, most of the study designs just wait for only 1 event to happen. So sometimes the follow-up times are going to be much lower so that we will not end up getting any information on the safety profile. And of course, like we cannot draw any conclusions on the individual components. Now, there is something called secondary endpoints. So secondary endpoints often give additional benefits in addition to those primary endpoints which we have stated. It also gives valuable information on the toxicity and safety profile. And like primary endpoint, the secondary endpoints also should be pre-specified. But only thing is, most of the time, our study design might not be sufficiently powered to tell that the secondary endpoint are statistically significant. So we should not actually draw hard conclusions from the secondary endpoints. Then sometimes this is another term which you come across, exploratory endpoints. This need not be stated prior to the study. These are clinically important events that are expected to occur too infrequently to show a treatment effect. Sometimes you might observe that in course of the study, one particular event is happening. So that is an exploratory endpoint. This is something which actually you stumble upon as you progress with the study. Now, we need to be careful about certain things while assessing the endpoint. Suppose if we are using a particular equipment, for example, you want to check the weight. So you need to ensure that you are using a properly calibrated equipment. You cannot keep on using multiple weighing scales to assess the weight. It should be the same equipment which should be properly calibrated. And if there is any consensus guidelines on the measurement, for example, some of the lab measurements and all, there might be guidelines on how to go around. So we have to stick on to those guidelines. And if there are any standard definitions, we have to stick on to those standard definitions rather than trying to find new endpoints. And suppose if it is actually something observed, so how actually it will be assessed? For example, you are checking the blood pressure. How you are going to check the blood pressure? How many observers will be checking the blood pressure? Whether there is any variability among the blood pressure, and whether the observer will be blinded to the allocation arm. And sometimes we will be reporting patient-reported outcomes. For example, quality of life in the population. Now you need to see whether this questionnaire is validated in your population. Suppose if you are using a non-validated questionnaire, then that is going to affect the integrity of the study. And whether somebody else has looked into this problem and what they have did. It's always a good idea to read the prior literature before embarking on a randomized control trial. And sometimes you'll have quite a lot of problems in defining the endpoint. Sometimes the endpoint is variable. For example, cognitive test. You do a test today, it might be different from tomorrow's results. Then there might be quite a lot of subjectivity, again, which should be avoided. In such scenarios, you can actually use some approved scales. Sometimes you might not come across any gold standard definitions for your endpoint. And sometimes the parameter cannot be captured by numbers. For example, you are actually looking at the regression of the tumor. It is a visual impression by the radiologist. The size has shrinked or not. You might not be able to capture it into the actual tumor volume sometimes. Now coming to the most tricky scenario, that's the sample size calculations. So to calculate the sample size, we should know how much is the difference. And it should be something which should be statistically important and realistic. For example, we want to compare a new drug with an old drug. The old drug cures the disease in 50% of the individual. Now, this is not an inferiority design. You want to prove that the new drug is going to be superior. Now, is there any point in putting the target difference as 51% for the new drug when the existing drug is having an efficacy of 50%? And if the existing drug is a very safe drug, no significant serious toxicity concerns, probably putting a target difference of 1% with a new drug, probably that is not going to give you any important information. So you should have a target difference which is important as well as realistic. Then the type 1 error, which is usually fixed at 0.05, and type 1 error is much more serious error. You might end up concluding that the ineffective drug is efficient, and you might end up prescribing it to quite a lot of people. And type 1 error generally is fixed at 0.05, and the type 2 error is fixed at 0.02. And again, the study design, whether it is a superiority design, whether it is an non-inferiority design or an equivalence design. Generally, non-inferiority designs needs much more sample sizes. Equivalence design compared to a superiority design, and equivalence design also needs slightly larger sample sizes compared to a superiority design. The other factors would be the allocation ratio. Normally, we allocate patients into 1:1, but sometimes to increase the enrollment. For example, if we allocate the new drug and placebo or existing treatment in a 2:1 or a 3:1 ratio, it might be much more easier to get participants because your chances of getting the new drug is quite high. So people might be quite interested in joining the study. But the problem with uneven allocation ratios is that it might need to a little bit of extra noise because of the uneven allocation. So you need to increase the signal. So you have to increase the sample size numbers. And sometimes after sample size calculation, always dropouts will happen in RCTs. So it is better to inflate the sample size a little bit higher based on the expected number of dropouts. For example, you are expecting 10% dropouts, you have to increase the sample size by the 10%. And of course, you cannot keep on doing a 50% dropout. You cannot expect that 50% would drop out, and you cannot actually go for a 50% hike. Now, from where we will get the target difference? So, if there is a pilot study, that is going to be the best source. You can simply put what observation you found in the target study, pilot study, into the new study. Then sometimes pilot studies might not be available. So you will have to see whether there's any systematic reviews or meta-analysis which has reported the sample sizes. Then suppose that is not there, you can actually see how much is the effect size reported from the literature. And suppose nothing is there, you are actually going into completely unknown terrain. Probably you can have expert opinion. You can actually consult skilled persons in your specialty. You can do it in a proper way. You can actually do a Delphi survey or something like that. And you can even quote that in the literature. You can quote that in the method parts. And judgment call probably better avoided because there is a chance that you are likely to go wrong. Yeah, this is something which I have already discussed. And this is how we should report the sample size calculation. So, Mentor trial compared cyclosporin with rituximab. So, the power was 80%. Power is actually 1 minus the beta error. If we set the type 2 error at 0.02, it's going to be 1 minus 0.02. So, it's going to be 80%. And it is a non-inferiority study. Non-inferiority study, usually we take an alpha of 0.025, and the non-inferiority margin was set as 15% on an absolute risk difference scale, assuming that 55% of the patient in rituximab group and 45% in those cyclosporin group had a complete or partial remission. So they have put a 15% point difference. Suppose if the cyclosporin, the efficacy of cyclosporin was 45. So that means anything 15% lower from cyclosporin is acceptable to state that rituximab is non-inferior. But fortunately, this study showed that 60% responded in the rituximab arm and around 20% only responded in the cyclosporin arm. So, which actually means that rituximab is superior compared to cyclosporin. So now moving on to the randomization, allocation, concealment, and blinding. So there are different randomization techniques. Simple randomization, the closest example is flipping a coin. But the problem is, if you flip the coin multiple times, let's say you are actually flipping the coin 5 times, you might actually get 4 heads, you might get 4 tails. But this is an extreme scenario. This is the ideal scenario you want. You want actually 2 heads and 2 tails. But it could be anything. The problem with simple randomization is probably you might end up allocating unequal sample sizes in the intervention and the control arm. So to avoid this, we go for a block randomization. Block randomization with small blocks ensures that the sample size is equally allocated in the intervention and in the control arm. So you prefer small blocks. When we end up having larger blocks, we tend to have some unequal numbers in both arms, and it should be a multiple of the groups. For example, you have 2 arms, the block size could be 2, 4, 6, 8 like that. So let us say I'm planning to block randomize 12 patients to 2 equal groups, and I am using a block of 4. So there are 6 different ways in which A and B are the treatment groups. Like let us say A group receives treatment A and B group receives treatment B. So there are 6 potential ways in which I can allocate A and B equally. Now, what happens in block randomization? I need 12 patients. I have 12 patients. So I am using blocks of 4, and I have to actually randomly choose 3 sequences from this. Now, the sequences selected are 2, 6, 5. This is completely randomly done. You can actually use a software, or you can use some Excel or some other software for doing this. So, which means that the first sequence is 2. So, the first patient will go to group A, the second patient will go to B, third patient will go to A, and the fourth patient will go to B. So likewise, the second sequence selected is 6. So the first patient will go to A, second will go to B, and so on. So small blocks, equal number of blocks ensures that the number of patients are equally divided in both intervention and control arms. But suppose if in this scenario, I use block of 2 and 6, this is too small sample size, I might end up having unequal allocation. Now, the problem with equal sized blocks is, let us say, if this is an open label study and I am the person who allocates, and now I know that first person has gone in, I know that allocation is done in blocks of 4. First person has gone into A, second person has gone into B, and third person has gone into A, and what is left? Even without actually opening the allocation sequence, I know that the fourth person will actually go into B. Now, if I don't want the fourth person, say that person come in, I feel that, okay, he is not a suitable candidate for the study. Or suppose if A is the active drug, I want him to get the active drug, I can actually manipulate at this scenario. So if it's an open label trial, it is always recommended to use unequal blocks rather than equal sized blocks. Now this is a problem with the block randomization. I allocated 6 individuals into treatment A and 6 individuals into treatment B. The age is comparable, gender is comparable, but unfortunately treatment A got 1 diabetes and treatment B got 3 diabetes. So sometimes it is possible that in spite of randomization, some key variable is unevenly distributed among the groups. So for that, you have to do something something called as a stratified randomization. So let us see how we goes with stratified randomization. The same population, 12 individuals with 4 diabetic patients. Now, we first divide them into diabetics and non-diabetics. Now we do the randomization. I'm doing in blocks of 2 because actually this is too much of a sample. There are 2 treatments, so I can very well use a block of 2. So I'm doing it in blocks of 2. When I do that, so it will be like this. Treatment A gets 6 patients, 2 are diabetic, 4 are non-diabetic, and same is the distribution in treatment B. Now that brings to another question, like can we keep on adding the strata like this? The problem is Stratified randomization ensures even distribution of the key variable, but the problem is it is not feasible always. For example, if you are doing a study in the emergency department, then it is not going to do all these things. And another big problem is a higher number of strata results in significant imbalance. So let us see this. The same population, I have added one more color. Yeah, this is a population of CKD. Some of them are having diabetes. The green circles are having coronary artery disease also. Now, I stratify based on diabetes. The same 4 people actually has gone to diabetic strata, and there is another non-diabetic strata. Some of them are having coronary artery disease. I stratify again based on coronary artery disease, and now I am going to randomize them by using blocks of 2. So this is how it would come. The three diabetic individuals, 2 of them got allocated to 1 arm and the other one got allocated into 3 arm. There was no 4th patient to go to treatment B. And yeah, there is only 1 patient with the diabetes and coronary artery disease. So there is nobody in this arm. Now let us come to the other arm. So it's going to be like this. See, ultimately, I was trying to ensure that there is equal allocation in both arms. Now, since I used a disproportionately higher number of strata, I ended up having something like a simple randomization. So, you cannot keep on increasing the number of strata to ensure that equal allocation is happening. If you go above a certain limit, you might end up having a scenario like this where the patients are unevenly distributed across the treatment arms. So this is just a simulation exercise to see how it happens. If there is no strata, I am randomizing in blocks of 4. Each arm would get 50 each. Now, if I use 2 strata, the imbalance will become 4. If I keep on increasing the number of strata, the imbalance will become higher. Now, again, the same study, same sample size, I am using block of 4 and 6. Now, if you can see, greater imbalance will be there if you use variable blocks. Now, that brings to the other question, how much strata can be there? So, there are no definite guidelines, but a usual rule of thumb is it should be n minus 4 into the block size. For example, in a study with 100 individuals, it could be 100 divided by 4. Block size is 4. It should be 100 divided by 4. So 4 into 4. So 100 divided by 16. That is the maximum number of strata. There are some other rules which states that like at least around 20 individuals should be there in each strata. And if the number of individuals in each strata is less than 20, better not to go for stratified randomization. Now, this is a problem with small trials. When you increase the numbers, even with increasing strata, the imbalance tends to disappear. You see, the 10% imbalance happens when you put the strata number as 8 and the sample size as 100. Whereas the imbalance becomes only 0.4%, it's negligible when the sample size becomes 2000. Again, same thing, I have done the same simulation with the varying blocks. Again, it is going to give somewhat similar results. So, imbalance is not going to be a problem with stratified randomization if the sample size are pretty high. So, be careful while selecting quite a lot of strata in studies with small sample sizes. Now, coming to the allocation concealment. So, allocation concealment means that you have to conceal the sequence until the interventions are assigned. And you have to implement successfully, because if you don't implement allocation concealment, that is going to, whatever benefit you are going to get by randomization, that is going to sabotage at this stage. So allocation concealment is going to protect your randomization sequence. So this all has been described previously. You can use sequentially numbered opaque envelopes. So again, actually, to leave a paper trail, what you can do is you can actually write your treatment allocation in a paper, put a carbon paper along with it, then put it inside a foil paper so that to ensure that this is opaque and you cannot actually read it by keeping against the light. You put it in the envelope, then the time of allocation, you sign into the envelope, write the patient name into the envelope. Because of the carbon paper, you will see treatment A with the patient name there. Then other ways are you could actually do it with sequentially numbered drug containers, which are actually of identical appearance. And in multicentric studies, you can go for a central randomization where actually you use a computer-based randomization linked to participant involvement. So, and this is an area where there is quite a lot of confusion between allocation concealment and blinding. Allocation concealment is applicable at the point of allocating patients to group, and blinding comes only after. So you have to do allocation concealment, that is mandatory. If you don't do the allocation concealment, probably the effective use of randomization is getting compromised. You can or you cannot have blinding depending on the study design. If you don't do blinding, it is going to be called as an open label trial, where and blinding again can be single blind or double blind. Single blind means the patient doesn't know to which arm the patient is allocated, but the investigator definitely knows. Double blinding is a scenario in which the patient and the investigator doesn't know the allocation. So the allocation is going to prevent the performance and ascertain bias. All these things has been discussed by Dr. Saurabh Datta in the initial session. So I'm not going to elaborate on this. And it protects the sequence after allocation. The most important thing which protects the sequence is allocation concealment. And after allocation, blinding is going to protect the sequence. Unlike allocation concealment, you cannot guarantee blinding always. So participants can be blinded, investigator can be blinded, and in addition, you can blind the data collectors and the data analysts so that actually no manipulation of the data is possible at any scenario. Yeah, this is something, yeah, that brings to another question, whether blinding is possible in invasive procedures, depending on the procedure. For example, if you want to do a procedure like sympathectomy or something, in the Simplicity trial, you can what they did was they went for a sham procedure. Sometimes in surgical procedures, you can actually create an incision, but you can actually skip the other steps. Then suppose if you are dealing with something like a pacemaker, you can put a pacemaker, but only thing is it will not be switched on. So it is possible to a certain extent in invasive procedures, but not often. So what are the potential effects of blinding? Participants are less likely to leave the trial because they might be thinking that there is a chance that they might be in the intervention arm, and they might not actually lecture to other participants about the adverse effects or the problems because they are not in the intervention arm. And generally, compliance tends to be much more better compared to open label trial, and the physiological and psychological responses are less likely to be biased. Investigators, it avoids preferential care to a group, and the detection bias also comes down. And assessors are also less likely to bias while actually assessing the outcomes. For example, in an open label trial, suppose we want to elicit the adverse effect. The assessor might keep on probing the patient regarding the adverse effect because the assessor knows that this patient is in the intervention arm. The problem with open label trials where no blinding happens is performance bias, ascertainment bias, and attrition bias, because the patient knows that actually he is not in the intervention arm. There is a likely chance of dropping out. I'm not elaborating this because of shortage of time. And again, all these things has been discussed in the initial trial. Now, sometimes blinding will not be possible because you are doing a surgery and it might be unethical, or it might be difficult to get patients if you do a sham procedure and all. So now in that case, you have to standardize the treatment of the both groups. You have to use an objective measurement, and the measurement should be reliable. And another option is you can actually leave the decision to a blinded adjudication committee who doesn't know in which arm the patient is there. And probably you can keep on duplicating the assessments. And finally, you have to acknowledge it as a limitation. The four major problems which happens in a randomized control trial on follow-up is non-compliance, treatment switching, loss of follow-up, truncation by death, and other event. In an ideal scenario, say you recruit 100 patients into intervention arm and 100 into the control arm, all 100 should be available at the end of the study period for assessment. And suppose if you have a significant loss of follow-up, say 50% are lost to follow-up, then probably the reliability of the study comes under the scanner. Now coming to analyzing the results. So in intention to treat analysis, means that all participants who are randomized are included in the statistical analysis. Doesn't really matter whether they didn't receive the intervention, they changed their minds after giving the consent and randomization, whether they dropped out, whether they cross over to the other side, it doesn't really matter. They are analyzed according to the group they were originally assigned. And it preserves the prognostic balance and it preserves the sample size, and it is going to give an unbiased treatment effect. Per protocol analysis consists of patients who completed the trial without any major protocol violations. But the problem is the groups are not comparable. The randomization ensures that the groups are comparable for known and unknown risk effects. But the problem is here, you are actually taking out a group of people who did not complete because of some reason or other. So the groups are not going to be comparable for the known and unknown confounding factors. And it is possible that more compliant subjects are analyzed, and those who actually did not complete, they were not really compliant with the treatment as well. And actually this can be considered as a non-randomized observational comparison. Now let us say a superiority trial. So here actually 10 patients are there. They have been allocated to treatment A and treatment B. And now in the treatment A, 70% responded, and in the treatment B, 60% responded. Here the effect size is 10%. Now let us see a scenario in which actually some of them had dropped out. Yeah, here actually there are 2 dropouts from the treatment A arm. There are 2 dropouts from the treatment B arm. And if it's an intention to treat analysis, this is going to be the result you're going to get. Now, if we do a per protocol analysis, we are actually including those patients who have come till the final follow-up. And this is how it would look like. So here actually the numerator has changed, the denominator has changed. There are only 8 participants and the effect size becomes 75% versus 62.5%. So the effect size is 12.5%. So what happens when we use per protocol analysis in a superiority design is it tends to exaggerate the effect size. So in a superiority trial, and this is actually a biased estimate also. So in a superiority trial, the primary analysis is intention to treat analysis. It gives a more conservative estimate, and you cannot call a trial a success based on per protocol analysis alone. It is not acceptable. To a superiority trial to call it a success, the intention to treat analysis should show a significant effect. Now still we report per protocol analysis in superiority trials because it actually gives quite a lot of information to the investigator as well as the patient. So basically it also gives an answer to the question, what would have been the effect of the experimental drug if all patients adhered to the study protocol. But again, we need to know that actually it might not be because of adherence, it might be because of compliance also. And it is also important to patients when deciding on whether to take this drug or not to take this drug in future. Now, in per protocol analysis, we will be, in intention to treat analysis, we have to assess, we have to include all the patients who are randomized. Now, the big question comes, what are we going to do for the missing data? So, the simple thing is a simple imputation. The most common way we do a simple imputation is you carry the last observation forward. For example, it's a 1-year trial and one patient has been lost to follow-up at 8 months. You carry the observation at 8 months forward. But this is actually a biased way of doing. Another way of doing is for the same patient, let us say you have more than one of the, you have a couple of observations till the 8th month, and after 8th month nothing is there. You can use regression to find out what would be the next value. Then multiple imputation is nothing but regression, but basically you are repeating the regression multiple times, say for a couple of times, 50 times or 100 times, and you're going to take the average values. Now coming to the non-inferiority design, which one will you use? The same situation which I have shown before. There's a 70% versus 60% difference in 2 treatment arms with an effect size of 10. Now my hypothesis is Drug B is inferior to drug A, and I have set an inferiority margin of 11%. Now, if we use the per protocol analysis, the inferiority margin which have come is 60%, sorry, 10%. The difference is only 10%. So it is well within the 11% pre-specified inferiority margin. And you need to remember that we are not going to just go by the effect size. We have to take into the confidence interval also. But in this scenario, I have not calculated the confidence intervals because it is going to be pretty wide with this small sample. So if I use a per protocol, if I use an intention to treat analysis in a non-inferiority design, here it is okay. The effect size is 10% lower when compared to drug A, and I have put a non-inferiority margin of 11%. So I'm concluding that drug B is non-inferior to drug A. Now, if I do the per protocol analysis, the results, see the effect size difference is 12.5%, where actually the difference is well outside the margin, and the conclusion is the drug is inferior. So in a non-inferiority design, we will never go by intention to treat analysis. Your intention to treat analysis and per protocol analysis should show concordant results to call a drug as non-inferior. Now again, this was actually discussed, I think we are already approaching the time limits. Now reporting the data, you have to use the appropriate statistical test. This is a simple test, which is basic tests which are used in a parallel arm design, where you actually take the score at the time of the exit. There are other complex designs as well, but it's not possible to discuss all these designs, all these statistical tools today. Now, the final question, whether the treatment worked or not. You can actually, in binary data, you can show it by relative risk or odds ratio. But there is a small problem with relative risk and odds ratio. Let us see two scenarios. One scenario, actually what I meant is not intervention. Yeah, this is actually the mortality. The control arm, the mortality is 50%, and the intervention arm, the mortality is 30%. The relative risk is 0.6, which actually means that there is a 40% reduction in mortality in the intervention arm compared to controls. Another scenario where the mortality was 8% in the control arm and 5% in the intervention arm. Now, if we calculate the risk ratios, again it is 0.6. There is a 40% reduction. But do you think that these figures are comparable? This is the problem when we use relative risk or odds ratio alone, because the prevalence of the event is also something which actually needs to be taken into consideration. So, to avoid this issue, what we do is we actually express it as the absolute risk reduction. This is actually the difference between the effect sizes in the two arms. So here the absolute risk, here this when expressed as a proportion, this is expressed as 0.3 and okay, actually what I meant was 60%. So this actually should be 0.2, and here this should be 0.3. Now the numbers needed to treat, okay, this is actually, I did the calculation with 0.3, so ideally it should be done with 0.2 only. So if it is done with 0.2, the numbers needed to treat is 1 by the absolute risk reduction. 1 by 0.2 is going to be 5, and here 1 by 0.03 is going to be 33.2. This means that in this scenario, if we treat 5 patients, 1 patient would be saved. And here in this scenario, if we treat 33.2 patients, then 1 patient would be saved. So which is going to be the better drug? The one which actually produces effect where the NNT is going to be less. Similarly, if in continuous data, you express it as standardized mean difference. Here, this is actually the difference between the mean of the your intervention and control divided by the pooled standard deviation. And effect size, this is something otherwise called Cohen's d. A ratio of 0.2 means that the effect size is small, medium means 0.5, and more than 8 is considered as a large effect size. So I have not covered quite a lot of things like interim analysis and pilot trials, pilot studies in this discussion because of the lack of time. So probably I think I can catch up with a couple of these things in the advanced research methodology workshop.
Priyambada, thank you very much for an excellent lecture. Now I request Atul to take over for managing the question answer session. Atul, please go ahead.
That was an excellent presentation, and it has generated a lot of questions. So let me start with some. The first question by Dr. Radhika. How does multiple primary outcomes increase alpha error?
Okay. There is a concept of family-wise error. So when you do a statistical testing, let me take a real-life example. Radhika, somebody blinds you and you are actually taken to a place. You don't have any other idea about the surroundings. You are taken to a place where you can actually smell some roses. Okay, there are two possibilities. You might be in a rose garden, or you might be smelling the actual rose flowers. It might be a garden, or it might be a flower shop, or something else. And it is possible that you might be smelling a perfume also. Somebody has sprayed some perfume. So this is actually how we go about while testing the hypothesis. We are totally blind about what is going to be the outcome. You cannot certainly tell that we are actually doing the right thing. So now, how will you know that whether you are actually smelling the flowers? You try to feel the flowers. You try to actually get some inputs from the surroundings. Okay, so that is how you would do. So when we do one test, you are actually committing an error of 5%, which means that there is a 95% chance that you are correct and there's a 5% chance that you are wrong. Now, if we run the same data for a second test, your error starts from 5% of that 95%. So every time we do a comparison, the alpha error keeps on accumulating. So when we do the comparison 4 times, your alpha error is going to be somewhere around say 18 or 19%.
Okay. Second question again from Dr. How is sample size calculated for multiple outcome trials?
I think actually this is probably for multiple primary outcomes, right? Okay.
Yeah,
so,
multiple primary outcomes.
So there are various ways. Actually, there are algorithms which incorporates the mean standard deviation of the multiple prime outcomes, but that is not seldom practiced. So let us say I want to take an example. Let us say I want to see how much is whether uric acid actually reduces the CKD progression, and my second objective is whether there will be any regression in LVH. So one way to do this is actually my first objective was whether uric acid reduces the CKD progression. So I fixed, okay, this is actually a multiple primary endpoint. So my alpha error, I am going to take it as 0.025. At that alpha error, I will find out how much is the sample size required to answer this question at a power of say 80% or 90%, whichever I choose. Now, actually for the second outcome, if I know the mean values and the variance, or say the, or even the proportion of individuals who actually show the LV hypertrophy regression, I can calculate the power for the second outcome. Now, if with this current sample size, if the second outcome shows a power of 80%, I need not really manipulate the sample size then. I can actually go ahead with the sample size calculated for the first outcome, that is actually the CKD progression.
Next question is, what is adjustment for testing multiple secondary outcomes?
No, you don't really come into any hard conclusion from the secondary outcome. So basically, I don't really think that adjustment for multiple secondary outcomes is essential, because you're not going to come to a hard conclusion based on secondary outcome. These are all probably bonuses which you get for doing a proper trial.
Another question is, can you please clarify difference between multiple primary outcomes and composite endpoints?
Okay, composite endpoints means that actually you have a group of say 2, 3, 4 or 5 endpoints, and your study ends when any of them is met. Multiple primary outcome means you have to follow these patients, and at the end of the study, you are going to assess both these outcomes. For example, in a composite endpoint, you are actually taking myocardial, let us say dialysis and progression to ESRD. You are following up patients with stage 3. Now, the follow-up period, let us say the follow-up period is 3 years. At the end of 1.5 years, one patient actually has reached ESRD, then the outcome has been met for that patient. We need not actually wait for that patient to develop, what I meant is actually you take two composite endpoints as dialysis, dependency and death, okay? So at the end of 1.5 years, the patient reaches one outcome, one part of the composite primary outcome, that is dialysis. Now your study stops there. And the other scenario, multiple primary endpoints, you're going to follow this patient till the end of the study period, stipulated study period, provided they don't die in between, and you are going to assess them at the end of the study period.
Okay. Next question is, can a trial be designed with multiple primary endpoints and then reported as composite outcome?
So that's not going to be possible, because you might be actually committing, you might be exaggerating your alpha error, as well as you might be compromising the power of the study. If it is designed as multiple primary endpoint, it has to continue as multiple primary endpoint. You cannot amend in between.
Okay.
Unless you do an interim analysis, you readjust the sample size and you get sufficient regulatory approvals, then that is possible. But halfway into a study, you just cannot simply change between the endpoints.
Okay. Next question is, can we change type 1 error while calculating sample size if the sample size becomes limiting?
No, what I understood is you actually put an type 1 error of 0.05 and you get, say, a sample size of 300, and you feel that actually you won't get that much patients. No, you cannot do that, because basically the power of the study is going to be much lower. So, and see, an alpha error of 0.05 means that there is a 95% chance that you are correct and 5% chance that you are wrong. Now, if we keep the alpha at 0.1, the chances become, say, 90:10%, and none of the accepted journals are going to accept any study with an alpha more than 0.05. It could be lesser.
Can you please clarify the term effect size?
Okay, effect size is, just a minute. Are we missing? Okay. Effect size. Okay, effect size is basically effect size differs according to whatever designs we are using. So you can have effect size in an observational study, and you have a totally different way to assess it. So in a randomized controlled trial, it is actually the difference between the treatment and the your control and the intervention, which is put in a standardized way. So it could be the numbers needed to treat or absolute risk difference if it's a binary outcome, or it could be Cohen's d in if you are using a continuous outcome.
If you decrease the alpha error further, will it increase the sample size?
Yes, so if we decrease the alpha error from 0.05 to 0.25, it's going to inflate the sample size. If we increase the beta from 0.8 to, so if we increase the power from 80% to 90%, again sample size is going to increase. If we reduce the mean difference, sample size is going to increase. If we increase the standard deviation or variance, again sample size is going to increase.
The next question is, for each additional primary endpoint, is 0.05 alpha error added?
Yeah, there are actually multiple ways to compare multiple primary endpoint, and one of the simplest one is actually what is called the Bonferroni correction. So what is being done in Bonferroni correction is, suppose if you have two endpoints, you divide the alpha by 2. So if you have two endpoints, the alpha becomes 0.05 divided by 2, that is 0.025. If you have 3 endpoints, you are going to divide the alpha by 0.05 by 3. Okay. Another way of doing this is, suppose if you have 3 endpoints, primary endpoints, before the start of the study, you can decide how to spend the alpha depending on the relative importance of the situation. You can assign an alpha of 0.0 to one endpoint. You can assign alpha of another 0.02 or 0.01 to another endpoint, and you can, it's up to the investigator. You can decide on how to spend the alpha, but only thing is it needs to be done before. There are at least a dozen methods for multiplicity comparisons. What I have discussed now is basically the simplest of the two.
If the outcome is death or significant morbidity, so in intention to treat analysis at the end, how will you analyze the loss of follow-up in treatment and control groups?
Suppose, see, like if you think that, for example, a cancer study, actually in that scenario, you have to design the study to assess the survival. So probably like this sort of parallel designs which we discussed might not be the best in those scenarios. The other way is actually, if they are not very frequent events, you can actually even go for a composite endpoint.
Okay, I think that ends all the questions. I'll hand it over to Dr. Rajapurkar.
Thank you very much, Priyamoda. As expected, very, very well done. Thank you everybody for joining.